Okay, the reason that deep water culture ultimately is, in my opinion, the most superior way to get the most yield and to express the maximum genetic potential of your cannabis, be it photoperiod or autoflower. It's just superior. Okay? And whoa, puppy. And the reason for that is because we know that after watching a year's worth of Tates, y'all know that cannabis plants love, almost above all else, oxygen to their roots. They are craving it at all times. So what growing in deep water culture or hydroponic setup allows you to do is introduce supplemental oxygen to the root zone. In this case, your root zone is water. Well, water, you can put a lot more air in there than you can in a pot of soil, okay? You can force air. It's forced oxygenation, all right? And whenever you're able to do this, it took me probably 4 or 5 years. I did a lot of college study on it, whole bunch of work on the maximum oxygenation levels of a deep water culture setup that are going to be, where do you see the benefits start to go away, okay? And after years of research, came up with exactly that. 10 liters per minute of oxygen into your reservoir. 10 liters per minute per gallon of reservoir that you have. Now, if anybody understands anything about air rate and flow rate, that is a lot. It's a whole lot. Okay? It's a whole lot. But that's what they love. Okay? Now, you can, almost all hydroponic setups are the ones that you can buy off the shelf, or the hydro buckets or any of that stuff. They all come with air pumps, and every single one of them and every single system that I've ever seen, I don't care if it's a undercurrent, the H2O, the big giant systems, none of them have enough air power. None of them have the adequate air supply needed for maximum genetic expression, in my opinion. Okay? That the majority of them come with about 10% of what you actually need and what will actually create them to thrive. Yes, they will grow. Absolutely, they will grow. Okay? If they have oxygen in there, they'll grow and they'll do good. For them to grow at an exponential rate and to have the cellular division happen at the fastest rate that I've ever seen is going to be introducing as much oxygen as you can. Now, that doesn't mean get the biggest freaking air compressor you can and stick a hose in there, folks. Okay? Because there's turbulence. There's agitation. There's little roots. Okay? They're growing in the water. Well, if you're just beating them all up, they break and they snap, and it's no good. So you have to diffuse the air and the oxygen properly. Okay? Now, most people are familiar, if you're familiar with the deep water culture setup, okay? You have an air pump and you have a hose, and then on the end you have a little air stone. Okay? Again, most setups that you're going to buy off Amazon or out of the grow shop or whatever are severely underpowered when it comes to air and air stone diffusion. Okay? So, you want to make sure, and the easiest way I can explain it is, again, 10 liters per minute per gallon of reservoir water that you have. Okay? That's going to be, it's going to be a lot of air. If there was no air stone on it, I mean, it's just bubbles, okay? And so you can take one of two routes. You can either get a large disc diffuser, which is they're about $25, $30 a piece. They can get pretty expensive if you're running a multi-site reverse recirculating deep water culture system, or you can buy several of the cheap the little round ones. Those work just great. And if you split your main air hose off into about four or more. The more diffusion, the better. I've never really seen it be too much diffusion. It just gets into like how many air stones are taking up the root space. Okay, so diffuse it properly. You want a whole metric ton of the tiniest bubbles that you can in a very soft blanket of tiny little bubbles. Picture this in your mind if anybody's ever watched Olympic diving. Okay, I know you're not going to be like, what the hell are you talking about, Derek? Olympic diving. Has anybody ever noticed whenever they dive off the diving board? Well, what they dive into is bubbles. It's literally bubbles. It's a whole bunch of bubbles, and that is exactly what you want to see in your reservoir bucket, is a bunch of, just a soft blanket tickling. Think of, I just had this thought. When you pour a Coke, I'm from Texas. Yes, all sodas, all pops, all carbonated beverages are Cokes, by the way. When you're pouring a Coke, think of those tiny, tiny, tiny little bubbles and how they just little flicker, little tiny little bed of tiny little bubbles. That's what you're looking for when you are, like champagne, absolutely. When you're doing deep water culture, you want a layer, a thick layer of tiny, tiny little bubbles for those roots to be suspended in. Okay, that's going to be what happens. Now, with that being said, generally speaking, you're going to see a longer cycle time on deep water culture setup. Not by a tremendous amount, but it can be 10 days or more, 10 to 14 days extra on the cycle time. Now, the reason that is because, as you folks have followed along, you know that the flowering trigger for day neutral cannabis, for autoflowers, is root resistance and root pressure. If you think about in a pot, okay, once they get to the edge, they're there, okay, and they're static because of the atmospheric pressure. Well, when they're suspended in water, there's not that weight, okay, so there's less osmotic pressure, okay, and so there's less pressure on those roots to tell them, and so that bucket, it has to get pretty dang thick with roots before it'll actually start doing its full flower thing, okay, and so that's how you folks see, folks like Rick DeValley and Joe Kanai and, these folks out there that are, actually, I think Joe's in soil. George Fromgen, he's in an autopod. The folks that are doing deep water culture that are doing really good, they all have adequate amount of air and they all have the proper diffusion, okay? So that brings me back to what Sherry Bottiger was saying and talk about CO2. CO2 and what does it do, okay? See, I've been running CO2 with my autoflowers since I've been running them, okay? Again, maximizing the cellular division in these plants is your goal. You want them to grow as fast as they possibly can due to their short life cycle, okay? Their short life cycle is going to, there's all kinds of things you can do. Again, introducing a deep water culture setup with adequate air, all right? Things like LST, there's all kinds of stuff. One of the main things is CO2, carbon dioxide. All right? Just like we breathe in oxygen, plants breathe in CO2. Okay? Now, does it really, it gets into a little bit sciencey, but essentially what happens with CO2 is it allows the stomata on the plant surface to open up more. Okay? What the hell does that mean? All right, respiration. All right, transpiration and respiration. Respiration is what we do. Transpiration is what they do. They are constantly exchanging oxygen for CO2 through those stomata. Okay, through the stomatic openings in their leaf, their pores in their leaf. When you introduce CO2 supplementation, it allows those pores to, instead of going like this to this, they go from this to that. And then they go that. And so it's exchanging the oxygen and exchanging the CO2 at a much higher rate and more efficiently, causing more rapid cellular division. Okay? Sorry, James. Somebody wanted me to talk about deep water culture and then somebody said CO2. Sorry. You get, so they breathe in CO2 just like we breathe in oxygen. I'm going to take a sip of my dew real quick. Ion, and always be mindful of is your pH, your potential hydrogen. Okay, because with a deep water culture setup, you are responsible for giving the plant everything that it needs. Okay, and that includes maintaining a proper pH to actually have the nutrients that you put in the water absorbed by the plant. One thing about adding more air is that it will inevitably make the pH very, very wild and erratic and all kinds of stuff. There's a product out there that our lovely number one admin moderator Michael Wildschultz has been using for years, the Taurus Hydro. It's a device that you can actually hook onto your buckets that allow it to maintain the proper pH going in, so you don't have to add anything. It's a super cool deal. If you're running DWC, I suggest you check it out. Okay? Let's do another dab. How about it?